Awesome. Welcome, everybody. Excited this week because I get to talk to Alexia Mandeville, and we're going to talk about some of my favorite things on the planet, which is how do you get your first job? Like, what kind of things should you be looking for when you're trying to break into the industry, and what's it like running an indie studio? So I'll let her introduce herself real quick, and then we'll just kick things off.
Awesome. That was a great intro. I feel super pumped.
So Guille, a buddy of mine over at Chromatic, made that for me,
Oh, it's good.
which was super cool.
Yeah. So I'm Alexia. I am currently working with another business partner that I have, a development partner for Bodeville. That's our studio. I worked at Niantic before that and Meta before that. I worked on Peridot, a pet simulator game, and also Facebook Horizon. So I was in VR for a while. I'm from Orlando, Florida, where you are. So that's a little bit about me. I focus primarily on the game design portion, marketing. Um, yeah, like a lot of different hats because we're only two people. So do a lot of art as well.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think that's how we ended up meeting. Was I remember like my LinkedIn kept popping up. It's like people you should know from UCF, and
Mm-hmm.
like I think Kyle was posting on some of your posts, so it was like just
Yeah.
populating. And I know we're going to talk about networking later, but that's just a super easy to point out example of it, where it's just like again, if you don't post stuff and you don't try to get to know people, you're going to miss out on connections like that.
Yep.
Um, and what was it like trying to get your first job in the industry? Because obviously, here in Orlando, we do have some studios, but it is not necessarily, in the top probably 8 or so destinations you think of when you think of game design.
Yeah. There's a lot of DoD, Department of Defense, and simulation and training,
Hmm.
Lockheed Martin. So what my journey was is I was dabbling in like web dev before I got my undergrad, which was in game design. And then I started working at a studio during undergrad because I had connected with some of my professors and instructors. And it's called E2I Creative Studio, and they do simulations, training, serious games, things like that. It's not like AAA; it's more indie, and it's associated with University of Central Florida. So I actually started working there as an unpaid intern, also working another job in web dev um, to kind of support myself. And they eventually gave me a job there as a game designer. And then at some point, I had been there for 3 years or so, and I got like a title of project manager. I was working with all the clients, including College of Nursing, uh, DITRA, which I don't remember the acronym for that, but it's a military thing. And a lot of the people in my undergrad were interested in AAA, Blizzard,
Hmm.
big name companies because they're just, you know, alluring and at scale.
Hmm.
But what worked for me is I started off small and I just went from company to company and worked as like a prototyper, worked as a UX designer, worked as a data scientist, and I got just a ton of different experiences that have led me to like these larger opportunities at Facebook, or I worked at some places in the Bay that were a little less, well known, but it was working with like the creator of Second Life on a new
Hmm.
VR project. So um, I think I liked my route. I didn't go into AAA. I never really wanted to do AAA, but I got to learn a lot of different things.
Yeah, that's one of the things I always remind people is I'm like, when you work somewhere a little bit smaller, you get to wear more hats. And when you
Mhm.
get to wear more hats, you get to kind of dabble in different things and kind of see what feels better for you. The moment you go normally to like a bigger company, whether it's AAA gaming or even for someone who's looking into law or something, you go to a big law firm, you're literally going to do one thing and you're going to do it really well, and that's all they care about because the whole point is their goal is to have 500 cogs in a machine that are all just kind of doing their part. And the moment you start doing something outside of that, they kind of stare at you a little weird and they're like, yo, that's not what you're supposed to be
Yeah.
doing. I had a friend who worked at EA who told me that exact thing, and that was kind of when he decided to leave. Was he was doing art for, I think it was probably Madden at the time, obviously just because local, and he was just like he started working on something a little bit outside his realm, and they just kind of were like, dude, no, like just do your thing, just do it well. we got people who do that, and that's when he kind of just realized he didn't like being boxed in. So obviously pros and cons to both. And
I knew a similar guy who he was trying to go to Bethesda, but he worked at a place in Orlando. And he was a 3D modeler. He just made pipes all day.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah, I mean, it's weird to think about it. It's like with something like Bethesda, you're making something like Elder Scrolls or whatever. There's got to be someone whose job is just to drop items in inventory and make sure they have gravity. Somebody has to do that for QA.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
just remember back with Morrowind, they forgot on paintbrushes, and I had so much fun just floating around on magic paintbrush trails. Just because you could make your own little staircase and just go anywhere in the map. But it's just like a perfect example of if someone misses something, you end up with those kind of weird situations. And then you've worked, pretty much, smaller places all the way up to like Niantic. What was kind of the bigger difference working somewhere like Niantic compared to some of the smaller places?
I There's pros and cons to both. I mean, I'm smaller now. It's only two.
Yeah.
But I got a lot of awesome experience from working at these companies because I got to work on like tools for scaling up.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, at Niantic, it's like world scale, right? And it's this giant map of the world. So I got to work on designing tools for points of interest. So that I'm going to liken it to Pokemon because more people know about that.
Yeah.
But, you place your Squirtles by the water, you place your Charmanders by volcanoes, whatever. But like somebody has to go in and make tools to do that on the back end.
Mm-hmm.
So as a game designer there, I got to, design the game and the systems, but that also came with designing the design tools to make that happen. So that was pretty cool. It's also a good exercise in learning about community and like dealing with players, and just like getting community sentiment and getting feedback from people. I think that I learned that the most at Facebook, and it's just like getting feedback at scale and then seeing all the trends of that feedback rather than over indexing on like one piece of feedback.
Yeah.
But working in a smaller place, like you have a lot of more creative freedom, and just like you said, you get to do a lot more things, and there's less politics.
Is that kind of what led you to going back to a smaller place, just getting to kind of do more without having to worry about, again, the corporate structure?
Yeah. Like the higher up you get, you're just a political figure, and you are just playing politics at all times. Like getting a promotion is really about it's popularity contest sometimes,
Mm-hmm.
and getting people to work with you, being influential in your role, posting. Like that's what I
Mm-hmm.
learned at Facebook was I posted so much. We had Workplace, which was Facebook for work,
Mm-hmm.
and I would post like constantly. And it's really part of your metrics when you go to get promoted. It's like how many likes do you have? How many like engagements do you have? It's crazy.
It's
But
just wild.
I went trending and you can see all the stats and you can like put it in your promotion cycle too. But I went trending at one point internally, and I got like a ton of followers and like just a lot of influence in my role. And then when I quit, I didn't have that on the real world. I thought I was like extremely important inside, but like
Mm-hmm.
no one gave a shit about me like on the outside.
Mm-hmm.
So I was determined to like start posting and networking after I left Facebook to like get that back, just so I would one have people to like play test the games, to talk with, to get feedback, just to be involved in the community.
Well, and that's one of the posts I know I've remembered from you that I've seen is you mentioned that networking can be like a superpower in this industry. Um, do you want to kind of elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah. So one of the things that I did when I left Facebook is I started writing articles,
Mm-hmm.
and I've gotten a lot of opportunities from that, like being prolific on Twitter and just like posting constantly and being consistent. Because there's just like not a ton of people talking about this stuff. You'll see trends
Mm-hmm.
of like product management or what have you. But game design is like the systems and all this. I was researching that at my last job, and I was like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do here. So I just researched other games and like broke it down and posted my blog. And I actually got the art center teaching position from that because somebody found my blog. Um, I'm talking to you right now. So that I think that's an
Yeah.
opportunity. And I've just had like a ton of people reach out to me and be like, "Hey, I love your posts. I have like the same thoughts, but they just don't like speak it out." So it's like the networking gives you so many more opportunities than just like sitting in your house and not saying a word.
Hmm.
And in the beginning, I was very afraid of saying anything. Like, what do I know?
Hmm.
But after I started talking to the internet, like people validated what I wanted to say. And I don't know, it feels really nice to just get your word out there and like people engage with it. And
That's
sometimes you
awesome.
fail, but you just got to keep going.
Yeah, I think that was one of the best lessons you can learn in life is just that, failure isn't the end. You know, uh, I mean, heck, you can learn that just playing video games. You're gonna die.
Yeah.
Playing a game hard enough, you're gonna eventually die. You're gonna get back up and just keep trying. Otherwise, you're doing something that's too easy.
Yeah.
That's kind of how I always likened it. Is failure just means you're not challenging yourself. Like I found school boring because again, to me, it was just kind of like I'm not going to get an F. Like an F isn't a realistic concept to me when I was in school. Like I'm like, how does someone do that? Do you just not
Mhm.
show up for 6 weeks? Like that's really the only way they're going to give it to you. Otherwise, you're going to get relatively decent grades no matter what. And I'm like, to me, that just like you know kind of makes you fear failure because suddenly it's like, oh, this terrible thing. But the reality is like it should be something that's a little more common. It should be like, hey, it's okay. You didn't nail this one. Not
Yeah.
every time works out in your favor. And it's great, especially in the business world, because failure's common. Especially if you're trying to do something different, trying to do something difficult, you're trying to do something people haven't done before. Something you haven't done before. And
Yeah.
it's just like you always want to take those stabs at things.
What was
Um,
what was your journey into, because you posted and we talked earlier in the
mhm.
year and I was like, how can I grow bigger? And you're like, just put yourself out there, like people start talking to you.
Yeah, I mean, I have a weird background. So like I started writing about video games when I was like 16, 17. I would just, every night I'd be sitting there on AIM anyway. So I had nothing left to do. And I used to work in a call center. So like what else do you do when you're in a call center? I trolled the Xbox forums and just read stuff. Eventually started just like realizing, hey, I could write game reviews on a forum, and I started doing it. And
Mm.
this guy messaged me and said, "Hey, you're pretty good at this." He's like, "Can I give you games and you write them?" I'm like, "Sure." I was like, "I'm 17, dude. I got plenty of free time. Just give me some games." All of a sudden he's like, "You're better at this than I thought. Can I give you some money and I'll give you some better games and you can keep doing it?" And I'm like, "Yeah, of course." Now I'm getting paid. I'm like, "This is the greatest thing ever." Well, he sold the company to another guy. And then that guy basically was like, "Wait a minute, you were running the company. He didn't tell me that." He didn't realize that I was actually the guy doing most of the work at that point. So he's like, "This is great. I got the guy who was doing all the work."
As a
The
17
guy.
year old?
No, I by this point I'm 18.
Oh, okay. Oh, well,
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
so young.
Yeah. I was like 18. So then all through college, basically, I was getting paid to run a video game website. I was the main editor for a while. We had almost 12, 15 different writers, some big names actually now. It's kind of crazy for me to look back and I'm just like looking around the industry. I'll be like, yeah, I worked with that person. I worked with that person. I worked with that person, and it's just like I got to work with them early in their career. Some of these individuals now are like PR at Xbox, PR at Yu-Gi-Oh, PR at, independent
That's cool.
indie developer. They're over at Kotaku or Polygon or whatever now. And it's just cool to be able to look back and see that. Game Informer stuff like that. So I was just working with these type of people, and again, I also learned, hey, I can call up anybody, and they're gonna pick up the phone. And to me, I thought networking really was a superpower. I agree with you entirely. That's why that resonated so much with me because I started just calling people. I didn't realize it, but I'm a 19-year-old kid, 20-year-old kid. I can call into
Yeah.
an earnings call in EA, and if I ask a question, they will answer it. The CFO will answer your question, and I was just like, this is wild.
You learned that young.
And I was going through SEC filings. I was doing research that a lot of people, in my opinion, weren't willing to do. They were all just writing the same kind of articles, and I was going out trying to find weird stuff. I was doing a lot of interviews because I learned pretty quickly that the stuff that gets attention is either guides, to-do lists, like or top 10 lists or
Yeah.
something. or like you have to get some kind of buzzy article out of a really cool interview. So I started doing interviews and just looking how to frame, the different answers people gave me. So it'd be like all of a sudden be like, okay, I'm gonna put this up as networking is a superpower, and here's why, and I'll just use a clip from it or something. And then it would get attention and stuff would grow like that. And I just kept doing that. Eventually that site went under because the owner made some bad real estate investments. This is around, what, the 2008 collapse or whatnot. So all of a sudden, our revenue went from basically pretty decent to nothing. And I'm just sitting here. And I mean, I remember like my last 3 months there, I think I was working for free, just hoping that everybody else who was working there could get, some new gig somewhere. So I was just like trying to keep it afloat like as much as humanly possible. Because in my mind, I'm like, I did decent enough. I'm like, let me see if I can just help these guys like find somewhere to land.
Yeah.
Because I was still a student at the time. I'm like, at the end of the day, if I lose this job, I'm not. It's not gonna kill me. You know what I mean? My deal with my parents was like, as long as I stay, doing school, they're like, you can do whatever you want, video games. I remember when I first told my mom I was going to E3, she kind of panicked. She's like, you're gonna get kidnapped. And I'm like, no, no, they really do want to pay me to go play video games. It's like nobody pays people to play video games. I'm like, this is 2007 probably. So it was a different world back then than where we're at now. You know, now you have 13, 16-year-olds that are winning like the Fortnite World Cup or, Call of Duty championships and making hundreds, if not millions of dollars playing, playing games professionally. So I did that. And then, eventually I started up my own company just covering Xbox indie games at the time. And this was back when XBLA was big. It was before Steam was huge. And, the cool thing there is I learned, wait, talking to all these different indie devs, none of them have legal representation. None of them have lawyers. They're all just signing whatever Microsoft tells them. Because at the time,
Yeah.
Microsoft was the only real game in town, because it was before PSN had really taken off at the same way to kind of take on indie games, which flipped with the Xbox One and the PS4. But, it was before Steam was as big as it was. And then, it was just kind of one of those really weird learning experiences of, I learned really early on, content creator, like, man, none of these content creators have legal help. I learned really early on, none of these indie games people had legal help. Now I'm just like, when I graduated, I remember I was talking to, I think it was Chris Charla at E3, and he was just asking me, he's like, what do you want to do? I think he was trying to get me to take on a community role over there at Xbox or something, and I'm just like, I don't think I want to go that route. I was just like, I guess I'm going to go to law school or something, and I was just like, I just took the LSAT, did really well. And I'm like, all right, I guess this is the path. And I mean, even after graduating, it took me a while to find my footing to where I am now, plenty of ups and downs and failures. I can go through that whole cycle and tell you 25 different ways I messed up, and things that could have been, what if this could have been way more successful if I knew what I knew now, but again, I was young, I was learning, everyone with me was young and learning, we were just kind of trying to figure it out. Um, was a Twitch partner for a few years full time, and that was its own little mess. Just trying to navigate that lifestyle because again, suddenly you're totally in the whims of what your audience likes. Whether it's like, okay, we want you to play this game, and you're like, I'm fed up with this game. I want to play anything else. But that's what they want to see, and that's what they're willing to donate to. That's what they're willing to sub for. And it's just like it's a difficult lifestyle. Like it's really easy to always look and be like the grass is greener somewhere else.
Definitely.
Whether it's like, oh man, I don't want to do law now. I want to go be a game dev designer or something. I'm like, man, I know that if I was on the other side, they'd be saying the same thing the other direction. And it's just like,
I literally
it's
just said that. I was like, I want to do that.
just trust me, you probably don't, but it's just always funny to see, and then, for me, it's been great because I've now gotten to the point where I get to work with indie companies all over the place. I get to work with content creators all over the place. I get to work with NFL players, indie devs, bigger devs, publishers, brands, marketing companies, agencies, whatever, all over. And again, I like what I do. I like most of my clients, and that to me is something that I don't think most lawyers could say.
I just saw a post on Reddit the other day. Indies still don't have legal representation. They don't know anything about it.
Well,
Uh, There's a
it,
friend,
it's
everybody
it's
was like,
so difficult, if I'm being honest, and this is just me speaking bluntly as an attorney. Like, I've worked with indies before that sometimes, like, you'll give them the engagement letter, you'll tell them a price, and they'll just be like, "Oh, that's insane." And it's like,
yeah.
this is so discounted that you don't even understand, you know? And it's just like they just, kind of scoff at it because it's just like, it is what it is. But it's one of those things where, especially if you're being somewhat successful, it's really hard to like chase after people who don't necessarily sometimes want to pay,
Yeah.
So you just go back to the people who want to pay. And then it's like, it can be frustrating because, again, it's just like, there's a lack of understanding of like what things are valued, And I know like artists in particular deal with this all the time, You create something, it took you 7 minutes. They're like, well, it's worth 7 minutes of time. It's like, no, that
Mm-mm.
7 minute sketch, even though it's just very rough and pencil drawn or something, took 25 years in
Yeah.
7 minutes, you know? You're paying for 25 years in 7 minutes, not paying for 7 minutes, And it's really, that's normally how I have to kind of flip it to indie devs, is remind them like, what did you feel like last time someone tried to tell you that, like this wasn't worth what the price is, and that's one of the awkward conversations, and again, there's stuff that people like me do where we try to flat rate stuff, we try to discount it, we try to do just about anything we can to work with you, especially if you're willing to work with us and stuff and you're willing to, be reasonable about things. But then sometimes you just get someone who, the moment the bill comes around, they're like, yeah, I don't know, and stiff you,
Yeah.
and it gets frustrating, but there's plenty of people out there. I know some other great lawyers out there that work with indies, and it's just like, we want to help, like we really do. It's just like, you have to also kind of want the help,
Mhm.
and that's where it gets kind of messy because, I mean, again, someone like me, I know their industry incredibly well. I've basically covered it as a press person for 15 years, then worked in kind of biz dev for a while, and then kind of, you know now I'm doing full legal. It's just like, I know the ins and outs of what should be in a publishing agreement, and I know like what's kind of market and what's standard, and I know stuff that you're not going to get unless you're just getting a really good advisor who's been doing this for 25 years, and to the point that they're practically the one reviewing the contract and then handing it out to legal anyway. And even
Yeah.
then, like, there's still legal terms in there that that person doesn't know, and
Well, it's
it can
also
just
just
get messy.
helpful. It's helpful to like have a middle person between whoever you're working with, like if
Hmm.
it's a business partner or a publisher or whatever, like you dealing with that publisher, you're gonna have more like skin in the game, more emotions. But if you
Yeah.
have
Well,
another
there's a reason.
representative, yeah,
There's a reason why they tell lawyers not to represent themselves in anything, Like, God forbid you do something where you need help on something, you're too emotional, Like, it's like, even just like, okay, I'm getting my floors redone. And if I have to complain to the contractor, I kind of hate it because, like, immediately I'm just like a little more annoyed than I would be if I was calling on behalf of someone else. It's calling on behalf of someone else to just be like, hey, here's the SOW, here's what you delivered. They
yeah,
don't match. Fix it, please.
mhm,
When it's me, I'm like, oh damn, like, I don't want to have to do this. I know I gotta go talk to my wife about it. It's like, it just gets messy, And like, again, it's a perfect example of like, even like the example you said of just, with your business partner, it's good to have an intermediary. The thing I always remind people is, put it on paper. Like, put like basic rules in an operating agreement on paper. Because without that, you don't have something to like look at when you two have a fight or have a conflict.
yeah,
And as much as people want to assume there will never be a fight, there will never be a conflict, it doesn't matter if you have the perfect business partner on the planet.
there
There
will
will
always
be a point where you will both be so tired that you will have a little bit of a struggle. And
yeah,
again, like, work is never 50-50. It's like, I saw a good like Instagram reel or something from, like, I think it was Brene Brown or something, talking about marriage, where it's like, it's not
I know
50-50.
exactly.
Sometimes it's 80-20, sometimes it's 20-20, sometimes you don't add up to 100. And that's how business is too. There's a lot of times where like, you're just gonna be drained. Maybe you're going through like something in personal. Maybe you got health issues or something. Maybe, maybe your parents are sick or something. Something's gonna hit you. You could just be burned out. You could be working so hard that you're dead. And like, having someone else there who can kind of pick up the slack a little bit is great. But
Hmm.
at the same time, it's like, yo, you need something on paper for when that goes prolonged for like 3 years and the person suddenly is just not doing anything, and it's just like, well, what do we do now?
Yeah.
Um,
It's also just like forced communication. Like we had to talk through a bunch of different things when we started our business.
mhm,
Like, what does it look like if we want to quit? Like,
yep,
what happens if I get a different opportunity or he gets a
yep,
different opportunity? Like, what does the IP belong to the company? Yes, it does.
hmm
Yeah. What happens if we have fights or something like that?
yeah, and those are some of my favorite conversations to get to have, even though they are kind of awkward, because it's like you actually get to sit down with people and just hear how they think and hear them talk it out, and then their partner gets to hear how they think and hear how they talk it out. Normally, you can find a way to line it up really well. And I used to be told I was a little too morbid because I'd always start it with, what happens if someone gets hit by a bus? Anymore, it's now like, what happens if someone just gets their dream job with Google or becomes a rock star or something? Like what happens if they win the lotto and they just don't want to work anymore? Like there's other ways to frame it beyond the bus. The bus gets a bad rap, but like it's still the same thing. Anytime you're dealing with money, there's going to eventually be some level of conflict around it because, how do you spend it? How do you earn it? Who makes what? Who does what? Who spends more time? Who spends less time? Or does one of the people feel they're replaceable and the other one isn't? There's stuff that gets messy, especially if you suddenly want to add in a third partner for some reason, and one of the people's like, I don't really like that dude. Um, it can get interesting. What was it that you knew that made Bo the right person to kind of start this journey on a new indie studio together?
So we worked together at Niantic for about a year and a half, I think. So he was the eng lead and I was the design lead, and we just jived. Like we
Hmm.
had similar values. We were both just like, let's just get this stuff done. Analysis paralysis out the door. Like just ship it and try it out and like iterate on it from there. So that was something that we aligned on, and then we also just were in the same point in life in terms of career where
Hmm.
we wanted to do something on our own and not be controlled by somebody else as
Yeah.
much. Um, yeah, and just the communication aspect, like we had always chatted proactively and we were both pretty level headed about things. I think I'm a little more like uh, anxiety about things and he like calms me down sometimes, which is nice. But we both also had complementary skills. Like he
Yeah.
does engineering, he does all this platform work, he was a server. He knows how to make builds. He knows how to do all this technical stuff I don't know how to do. And then he doesn't really love social media. So, like, I do all the social media stuff. I've just learned all the marketing stuff. I was working on the design aspect of it with him. So the complementary skills was really important too. It's not just like I was an artist and then I'm not going to do anything else.
Yeah.
Like, we both wear a lot of different hats, and he does writing, I do writing. We split up design work. It's
Hmm.
just it's pretty fluid, but like we both have a certain subset of skills.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think complementary skills is always a huge factor that helps. And then the fact that you guys had already worked on a project together, so you kind of knew what each other are
Yeah,
like to work on something. And I mean, I even hear this when it comes to like hiring anymore from studios. They're like, man, I love being able to see what someone's already done? And I mean, what they've done is one thing, but like when you get to work with them on that project, that's even better
yeah,
because then you kind of see, okay, how does this person deal with conflict? How does this person deal with not getting their way? How does this person deal with, something being just more difficult than they expected, or deadlines being tight, or again, like an unfortunate family situation popping up and now they're stressed in their home life.
yeah,
um, when you know that you can work with someone like that, that makes it a heck of a lot easier to like kind of get invested. I always joke with people, like the moment you open a business together, you're kind of getting married, just
yeah,
in the sense of like this business is your baby now. Like if you decide to split it up, it's honestly very similar to going to divorce proceedings. And I mean, I've had to do that with some business owners before. Where I've had to help them split it up and figure things out. But I mean, it's just it gets awkward. So anytime you know that you've already like, okay, we've kind of worked together a little bit, I think that's always a good sign.
yeah. We were both also just committed. Like
Hmm.
marriage is commitment, and that's really like half the battle. I'm not married, but
Yeah.
just from my long-term partnerships and stuff, like
Hmm.
commitment is the battle because you have to be willing to get through the tough spots and move forward so that you can get
Yeah.
to the end goals. Yeah.
Um, so what have been some of the surprises you've run into when you've been kind of running this business?
Um, I've just learned a lot about marketing. Surprise wise, like I I just didn't expect to learn as much technical stuff about marketing myself. And like all of the ad stuff, keep this like diary of an advertiser thing where I
Hmm.
write all my learnings down, and like iterations of how I'm making ads or like doing just marketing, like outreach to streamers, outreach
Hmm.
to press, and things like that. And just learning about how you get into algorithms via like
Yeah.
reviews on Steam. So for our first game, it was really important to us to get 10 reviews on Steam on day one, because then we got into the discovery queue and people purchased our game a lot more.
Hmm.
We did for our next thing, we're gonna like do less ads because I think we spent like a couple $100 on ads the first day.
Hmm.
We're gonna do more like streamer outreach. So
Yeah.
we reached out to streamers and press, maybe like 50 to 100 people, and the return rate was like pretty low, is like 4%, which I guess is average. I was talking to somebody who used to work at HEB, the grocery store, and she said that's like a pretty average return rate.
It really depends on like how targeted that list is for me, because like for a little bit I actually did what I would call like D-list indie game, like reach out for streamers. And what I mean by that is I was working with a publisher who knew their games were going to come in right around a 60 on Metacritic, and
Oh,
they're like, help us get reviews and stuff for this, because again, even just getting it where it comes in at 60 or 70, it's going to sell better than if it has nothing you know so you had to figure out which kind of people are going to be interested in covering something like that, which normally meant you're going toward more of the enthusiast press. You're going for people who maybe don't get reached out to as often. You're
yeah,
not going to send that to Kotaku and Polygon. You're going to send that to someone who runs a smaller website that's very, very targeted to maybe that genre or this or that. And again, they may not love the game. You can't guarantee they're going to love the game, but at least you can get the press on it and you can get more articles on it. And again, like even with those games, there's nothing bad about them per se. It's just that their budget probably didn't match the scope of what they tried to do. So at some point, either it's missing something somewhere, whether it's a extra level of polish or maybe it isn't the best version of that genre or something. Maybe it's just a little overpriced or something. Who knows? Um, but like it was an interesting thing to learn coming from someone who'd been on the press side and the streamer side to kind of trying to help out a little bit there with some people. And it's definitely something I recommend anybody look at is like, figure out who your audience should be, because then you can get that 4% up, I think, because again,
mhm,
like it really just depends on if you're shotgunning it to everybody or, and there's nothing wrong with shotgunning it to everybody. You just know you're gonna, you're gonna hit that lower number because, it's not something where they're all gonna open it, but um,
I
you know,
did find it surprising that how difficult it is to contact these people. For
mhm.
instance, for like streamers, I would find them on Twitch via like a game that they played that's more similar. And then I'm like, well, there's no DMs here. So then I would find their VODs on YouTube. And if they had an email there, I would email them. And
That's
then,
a perfect example of how streamers need to get better, especially on the smaller side. Because again, when you're looking at, okay, let's just say you're making, a game that you're like, okay, this is not got combat, it's not PvP, it's not, like you're not building something, so it's not like a city builder or something, and it's more story driven, not really a huge amount of puzzles. It's like, who's my audience for that? And then you start finding streamers who play those games, and now they don't even have their emails listed anywhere on their profile. And that's definitely one of the things that anytime I work with someone, I'm always like, make yourself easy to contact. It doesn't even have to be your main email, just but make a email that's like, you know reach out at blank or something, just so that there's a way to get to you. Because I mean, it's the same problem for game designers. If I don't know your game exists, I'm never going to play it. For
Right.
streamers, it's like, well, I found you, which is hard to begin with, and then somehow I discovered you, but then I don't even know how to reach out to you. It's like,
Yeah.
I always tell people you can build the world's greatest bed and breakfast, but if there's no like off ramp from the highway, nobody's going to get to it. Nobody's going to find it. Nobody's going to be able to get there. And that works for both the devs and the streamers in this instance. Like, you got to do everything you can to make it easy to find your stuff.
Mhm.
So I,
And
I love the fact that you put that much effort into the
oh,
marketing side.
it's even more. So like I would find these streamers and then follow them on Twitter and hope that they follow me back so I can message them about their stream. I also learned that press is a very volatile industry, and somebody who wrote an article 4 years ago that's like very similar to the game that we made, they probably aren't doing press anymore.
Yeah, yeah. If they are, they probably jumped 6 different places, and yeah,
Yes.
it's unfortunate. But even just looking back, like I said, I used to work with a lot of people. Most of them are all on the game dev side now. There's an expiration date typically for a lot of press people, and the ones who make it past that, more power to you. But like, once you hit a certain age, you start thinking about different things. You're like, okay, I want to travel more. I want to like start a family, or I want to like settle down, or whatever it is. It doesn't matter which way you go. All those things cost money. And you start sitting back and thinking like, man, I don't want to live on ramen anymore. And the press side, it's difficult. There's some people who do it well and make a great career, but it's not something that I would typically ever recommend for a long-term career for someone who asks me.
No, maybe like a side hustle.
It was a great, like part-time job when I was a student. That was fantastic. Let's see. One thing I know we talked about, and this is something I've never seen anybody else on the game dev side publicly talk about, is you said that restricted stock units actually helped you kind of head toward financial freedom. And it's something where I love hearing that because, again, so often I think people get bogged down on just the top line number of their salary. And I see this a ton with my esports people because they'll sit back and be like, well, I'm going to make 380,000 this year over in this thing. And I'm like, cool. But you just moved from a city with no taxes to California. And now your tax bill just increased by 18% or something. It's
Mhm.
just like, it's stuff where I swear people don't always think about the different perks that could come around. Like, are you allowed to work from home? Are you able to have flexible time off? Are you going to be expected to work 60 hours a week crunch? Are you going to be allowed to work 40?
Yeah.
Do you have some ownership in the project if it does well? And that kind of stuff can go a long way.
Yeah, I didn't think about this pre Facebook really. I was given options which are different from our restricted stock units
Yep.
because you have to purchase them.
Yep.
And they may not amount to anything down the line if your company's not public. But anyways, I had options at High Fidelity, and those didn't pan out because they're not doing much anymore. But for Facebook, I got a base salary, and then I got restricted stock units. And at some point, I wanted to leave. I was like not interested in working on the team anymore, and a director came to me and was like, "Hey, we're going to top up your RSUs because to keep you here, essentially." And I was like, okay, whatever. Like, it doesn't mean anything to me. But then I started vesting and I started getting the money, and I the restricted stock units that I got altogether were $500,000.
Yeah.
So I didn't really think about that in the beginning, and I started vesting and like taking it out immediately because I was like, money, yes.
Yeah.
So it actually doubled my salary. That 500K vests over 4 years. If I had stayed the whole time, I would have gotten
Mhm.
it. So I got the base salary, and then on top of that, an entire another base salary.
Yeah.
So
And
that was
you
awesome.
mentioned something that a lot of people probably don't know and really should. Yeah, there's a huge difference between, restricted stock units and stock options and even just the vesting, and just knowing that, even if you have something like that, if it's a public company, odds are you can actually get rid of them. You can actually sell them pretty easily. They're easily liquidatable. If they're a private company, good luck.
Oh
A
yeah.
lot of times you're kind of stuck, you know?
Mhm.
And what I mean by that is, okay, like I have options in a couple companies I've worked with. If they don't sell or go public, they're just sitting on the table, you know? And one thing that I do that, again, I can't give you tax advice or anything because everyone's situation's different, you know? A lot of times I don't even exercise mine. I just leave them sitting there because again, until
Yeah.
there's a situation where I can get them out, it may not be worth exercising. Depending on your tax situation, how much you believe in the company, all that kind of stuff. There's reasons to do it from a tax perspective early, but a lot of times the best thing about options is again, it's just a way for a company that is paying a little bit under market for what something's worth to try to compensate that and give you a little bit of upside if the company were to blow up or sell.
Yeah.
So if you end up on the next rocket ship to the moon VC backed company that goes IPO and like say you had Roblox or Unity when they went last year or 2 years ago, I don't remember, then yeah, you would have been doing great. But unfortunately, there's probably 100 companies that never make it to that level, or
Yeah.
they eventually just aren't worth much. But especially if you're at somewhere that's public, it's a lot
Yeah.
easier to you know actually know the value.
There's also some companies that will do buybacks. So, like, I worked at a
Hmm.
company that did buybacks internally. I was never there for that, unfortunately, but I know people who made a lot of money.
Yeah, yeah, and those can be great too because a lot of times you have an investor that's coming in who wants to buy more equity than the company theoretically has or something. But there's a way for them to kind of get some of yours and move some stuff around and do some creative accounting. Like at the end of the day, that's what a lot of this feels like. No, it's super cool.
I will
Um,
say that if you do, get your vest and then you cash it out, be prepared for a large tax owe at the end of the year. I was
yeah.
not prepared for that.
Well, that's something even just as an independent creator, that's something you need to know. Even an indie dev like yourself, depending on how you're paying yourself, you maybe have to pay quarterly taxes at the end of the year, depending on the structure. And that is something that people get hit by. When benefit for me is when I first started doing all this stuff, I was like 17, 18. I was not making that much money. So I made my mistakes when my tax bill was a couple $1,000. I didn't have to make it when the tax bill was,
Hmm.
in the 5 to 6 figure range, and suddenly you're like, oh my god, what just happened to me? You
Yeah.
know. But yeah, no, those definitely, the tax man always comes. Like, there's a reason why they say death and taxes are the only two things that are assured in life.
Yes. CPA is a good person to hire and get a deal.
Honestly, I tell everybody, whether it's an indie dev, a content creator, or whatever, you almost always need a CPA before you need a lawyer. At the end of
Hmm.
the day, like, you're gonna pay taxes your first year. If you're running a really small business and it's a solo business, you may not need me yet, but you're going to, because there's going to be stuff that pops up, whether it's, a lot of people just don't even remember to file their annual reports. It's something
Hmm.
really simple. It's just you have to go in and say, yes, my company's active and here I'm going to pay my fee. Because again, the tax bill comes, the state wants to know that they get their beak wet. The city wants to know they get theirs. The county wants theirs. Everybody wants to know, that they're getting their little piece, and you got to remember to pay all those. And then, especially with my realm, once you start a company, you're normally going to run into, the basic formation questions of like, did you even set this up right? And that's totally different depending on what your goals are. If you're trying to be a 25-person company, then yeah, you're probably going to C corp because you're going to have to give out a lot of equity,
Hmm.
a lot of different people. It gets chaotic doing that with a LLC where everybody's a part owner and gets a K1. You know, if you're going to 1 to 2 person company, a 1 to 5 person company, LLC might be the way. You might be able to do things a lot simpler. And then you have less headaches on the legal front. But yeah, you definitely need a CPA because they will let what you're making, what you owe. And the biggest thing I always tell people is don't just talk to your CPA at the end of the year because then you're just doing retroactive things. You want to talk to them throughout the year. Like I talk to mine once a month about just basic cash flow stuff for like 20 minutes, and then we have a 1 hour call every quarter to go through tax planning. And again, it's just one of those things where for me, and he loves doing this, that's what he likes to do, is he likes to do the tax planning side. He doesn't want to have to filing the actual taxes is probably not fun. I'm making an assumption here, but like doing paperwork is typically not the exciting part.
Yeah.
Getting on a call with someone and telling them like, "Hey, I did this, this, and this, and now you're
Planning.
going to save $6,000 in taxes." It's like that's awesome, you know, like that's what you want to do. Um, but yeah, you definitely need to make sure that you're actually communicating with them. You know, at least twice a year, do a check in or something, just to let them know. Especially if something weird happens, like you cash out a ton of RSUs, because they're immediately gonna be like, "Oh crap, what can we do to like maybe tax harvest some losses somewhere else or something,
Yeah.
and figure out a way to kind of offset them things, maybe move some of it to property or something, There's different ways to kind of, structure and plan. And if you are someone who has a really large, windfall or something, start talking to financial planners too, because again, like everybody wants to think like, oh man, I'm going to be able to retire whenever they want, whether it's 65 or earlier. And I mean, I even had a meeting earlier today with one that I work with for another client, and we were going through that client's, stuff. And it's like, sometimes these individuals are making way into the high numbers that you'd be like, oh my God, this blows your mind. But if you're only earning that for 5 years, 10 years, and then you're suddenly hoping to live off that for the rest of your year, you better be investing it wisely, putting it into 401ks, IRAs, HSAs, whatever it ends up being that makes sense for you. So yeah, no, I love getting into the nitty gritty technical stuff on that. And again, one of the best things you can do is if you have questions about that stuff when you're about to sign it, just ask a lawyer. Normally, it does not take that long for someone like me to explain what an RSU is to someone. And again, you're more likely to understand what your actual compensation looks like. And again, you're more likely to even understand what is the odds of this actually hitting, Because again, if you're at a super private company that hasn't publicly taken any money and they're not profitable, then those RSUs are probably not worth much yet, Um, and
Are there
especially if
are there
go
any things to think about for certain states? Like, for example, California keeps coming for me. I lived in California. I haven't
move
lived there.
before you cash out.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, I was gonna
There's a
ask.
reason why immediately after or right before he signed his deal with Spotify, Joe Rogan left California and moved to Texas.
Okay.
So if you actually watch, you'll see it all the time. You'll see high net worth individuals make their money in Washington, New York, California, move to Florida and Texas, and then start cashing some stuff out. Because again, if it's in stock, it's like property, Property doesn't hit you till you sell it.
So I was
And it,
told that when I vested in California, so I was taxed in
yeah,
California.
you tax in California because that's where you vested. Options are a little different though, and this is part of the differences because options you buy. So you buy them at a certain price, so they vest at a much lower rate typically, a lot of times than otherwise, and then you get taxed on the difference when you sell them. So it can be unique. But
Are there
yeah,
any?
obviously talk to a financial person on
Yeah.
this. This is not something where I try to give tons of tax advice, but there's definitely some unique things that you can do. And again, especially when the numbers get larger, there's more games you can play. The system is rigged toward people with money. It's just a fact. Um,
Are there any things like that when you start a smaller company? Like just things to think about. So I know that Niantic was created in Delaware or
Yeah,
something.
so typically most companies are going to form in Delaware when they're going to go the C corp route and seek investors. There's a couple different reasons for it. Delaware law is really, really set in stone on the corporate side, so it just makes sense, and like investors feel safe there. States like Florida, for example, have some weird things like homestead law, where technically, let's just say I was committing fraud and doing terrible things, you still can't get my house. So if I put all my money into my house, then I'm kind of safe. And you'll see that, and you'll see why some of these kind of terrible people kind of just buy mansions and stuff like that.
Mm.
Because if it's your permanent residence, it's kind of protected in a way. Delaware is just very, very safe. Everybody understands it. Very, very simple to keep going from a taxation perspective, not too complicated. The law is just very, very strict and by the book, has very good minority shareholder protection. And the reason why that matters is because the person who owns the minority amount of your company is typically your investor. So they just want to know that, like, okay, if I give you $1 million and I only own 10%, you don't go out and do something stupid, you know? Um, so yeah, you'll almost always see people in Delaware for that reason. If you're starting a small business, don't just go do that. I had someone come to me one time and they literally had just looked at a public company before and they're like, okay, so I need 7 different subsidiaries. They all need to be in Delaware. I'm going to make this many LLCs and this many C Corps. And I had to pause and be like, okay, so what do you make in a year right now? And they're like, well, about 60. I'm like, okay, so you're going to make one LLC in the state that you live in, and then we'll talk when you are the size of that public company, and again, just trying to basically help understand why, because again, it's just really easy to look at somebody else and want to copy their homework.
Yeah.
But like, it's the same thing I tell people about contracts. Like, you can pull something off the internet, but it doesn't mean it's what's meant for you. You want to customize those to what you want them to say. And like, especially with game designers, they normally understand this analogy. I'm like, you don't take the rules for Yahtzee and play Monopoly. It just doesn't work. Even if they have the same pieces theoretically, you can't just make it work. It's just not going to look right. Um, and when you're thinking about setting up a company, that's where again you just want to get good advice for you personally. Because a lot of times LLCs make more sense. A lot of times in-state LLCs. Sometimes you want to plan for the future where maybe you are going to grow, and there's things like a conversion that can happen where you can move it from a Florida LLC to a Delaware C corp. I've done plenty of those, and there's lots of work there. And lawyers like me, we we work on Delaware C corps all day. That's super super normal. I'm used to forming companies all over the place. Again, I always remind people, 90% of the contracts you sign aren't actually even in your state. Especially in the tech world. You're used to signing something with Google that has California listed. You're used to signing something with
Mm-hmm.
this company that has New York listed. You're used to signing this thing with this company that has Texas listed. You don't need a lawyer from each of those states to read each of those contracts typically. Normally, the parts that are going to be state specific are going to be something that we can either read up on or reach out to someone and just double check. um, you're not going to see me in court in any other state anytime soon, but I'm also not going to court in Florida anytime soon. Again, like, my goal is to keep people out of court. The only people who make money in court are lawyers. That's not what I'm looking for.
Mm-hmm.
um, Want to make sure that, again, I'm trying to help my clients and help them use their budget in the most efficient way. A lot of times I'll just remind them, I'm like, you don't need gold plated legal yet. You just need good enough. And that way you can make sure that you're spending your money on whatever's making you money. We just need to make sure that we protect all the potential really bad things that could happen.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any advice for hiring? This is actually super pertinent to us right now because we're trying to expand like a little bit just in the art realm.
Yeah.
We're looking at doing contractor, and we do have a startup lawyer because
Yeah.
I haven't chatted with you at that point. Sorry.
Well, I mean, obviously, yeah, yeah, no worries, no worries. Obviously, one of the things you always want to think about when you're looking at stuff like that, it's just like, do you know the difference between a contractor and an employee, and are they going to be treated like a contractor versus an employee? Believe it or not, employment law is the number one area that I see indie devs make mistakes,
Okay.
and they do just all of them. Just somehow, every single thing that could go wrong happens somehow. I've had clients that have made people contractors who were clearly employees. I've had, clients basically fire people for the worst reasons, and again, stuff like that just happens. It's just like, you want them to talk to you beforehand, you
Mm-hmm.
know, that way you can help them avoid it, but like, I hear stories from other lawyers all the time about just various things that can go wrong. So it's just like, you just want to make sure that it's an area you're taking seriously. You know, if you have documents, you make sure they get signed, you make sure you do all the paperwork correctly, and you make sure you're thinking about, again, an independent contractor typically is allowed to decide where they work, how they work, when they work. They use their own materials. They're typically not trained. They're typically someone who can work for other companies. And the moment you start trying to limit all that and you start telling them, I want you to work here, I want you to use my computer, I want you to work these hours, I want you to only work for me, it starts to make it look more like an employee relationship. And then
Okay.
there's different rules between the two, you know. Everyone always thinks of withholding. That's the obvious one because you have to actually withhold taxes for employees. But there's other things as well, especially as you start growing. My HR buddies are all in my ear right now, and they're telling me like, okay, you know, you gotta you gotta have this thing at 5, you gotta have this thing at 15. You know, depending on the state, you may have to have various other things. You know, California, for example, requires that there's a retirement plan for all employees. Um, Something that's not going to be forced on you per se in Florida.
Okay.
So there's definitely differences all over the place depending on that kind of stuff. But you know, the gist of it normally is just make sure you have good paperwork and you've kind of talked it through, especially the first few.
Okay. Yeah, our lawyer. So we got a startup lawyer because I hadn't talked to you, but also he had worked with Bo's wife, and it was really just like we just needed an operating agreement,
Mm-hmm.
and we needed to talk through the worst case scenario. But he was like, "Don't hire anyone without talking to me. Like,
Yep.
we gotta get that done." You know, he charges an hourly rate. It's fine. I think it's well worth it.
Yeah, that's kind of the standard is, you know, at the end of the day, and this is what kind of sucks being a lawyer is because of the fact that our industry has not figured out a better way other than occasionally flat rating certain documents, other than hourly. People get
Mhm.
scared to talk to you because it's like, oh damn, that dude's gonna call me. Like if I call him, he's gonna send me a bill, you know? And again, I mean it's just it's expertise. Expertise costs money, but you know, people suddenly stop, you know, wanting to always contact. And that's where it's always fun if you can figure out some kind of creative arrangement where, again, people aren't scared to talk to you and you can make sure you're giving them the advice that they need to actually help their business, but also still not somehow flipping the dynamic to where you're working for free,
Yeah.
you know, and that's always a difficult balance that, you know, um, you can always have in a one-on-one conversation with someone. So one last question.
Mhm.
What made you want to create Chief Emoji Officer? Because it definitely feels like a little bit of a satirization of, you know,
A
big
little bit.
company life in Silicon Valley, and
It's
you know
totally
everybody's happy all the time. You know,
yeah.
nobody's allowed to be negative.
So when Bo and I started, we had just been prototyping some things. We knew we wanted to make a narrative game. We knew we wanted to use Yarn Spinner or Twine because those are narrative gameplay tools. We had been playing a short hike, so we, had a lot of inspiration from that. So we were prototyping 2 games, and we decided to go all in probably 4 months after prototyping on Chief Emoji Officer because it was a smaller scope. It required way less artwork, and we thought we could get it done pretty quickly, which we did in like
Mhm.
3 months or so. We were full
Oh my
time on it.
goodness.
Yeah, so I mean, we have been working on it and like thinking about it for a while, probably 7 months total, but it was really like from both of us all in to the finish line 3, 4 months. So just like the narrative aspect of it, like the tech world, we that's what we knew. Like he came from
Hmm.
Google, I came from Facebook, we met at Niantic. And it might be a little bit PTSD from working at these places, kind of like processing. But like Mythic Quest had just come out, and there was Silicon Valley, and those are satirizations of the game industry and the tech world, and they were super popular. So we wanted to, make a text adventure about it with a novel concept of um, only only responding via emoji.
Yeah, I always find Silicon Valley funny because I mean I haven't watched it in a while. I don't even think I've watched it necessarily since practicing like I have now. You know, but my memory of it is that the legal representation in that is much more realistic than any other show I can think of, like Suits or something, because those are insane. You know, like that's not even remotely true. You know, in those kind of shows, it's always like, oh, you got the smoking gun. You know, we can solve this
Yeah,
problem.
yeah,
The reality is normally it's like, no, you know, you kind of signed something stupid. You're kind of screwed, man. You
yep,
know, and it's like that's not what you want to tell people. You know, you always want to be able to deliver good news, and it's just like, you know, especially when you start dealing with like big law firms, most of what they're going to tell you is just it depends and charge you $20,000 to send you a memo that really doesn't say much more than you found on your first Google search. You know, that's one of kind of like what I get to do. I kind of frame myself more like fractional general counsel. And my experience with working with people who are more in that general counsel role is you're focused on the actual business and the actual health of the business and actually solving answers. So like coming back and saying, give me 3 weeks to write a memo is not acceptable. That business person needs that answer quickly, you know, and you have to kind of just make, a realistic determination of like, hey, can we do this thing? It's like, I think we can. Here's why, here's where the risk is. Here's what we need to try to avoid. Please don't do this thing or that'll be really bad. But like, okay, let's make a business determination of does this make sense, And
Mhm.
I like getting to get more embedded into the businesses. I actually miss having my background right now because I actually have a bunch of stuff that like I've worked on and companies I've gotten to do stuff with. But like I have a company called Loop that does sports cards. It's the only one that's near me for some reason. Probably was on my floor. Um, and the cool thing there is I got to go on their platform live and actually break cards and sell them, and it helped me understand what they did. So this is a company that does tons and tons of money by having independent businesses go live, very similar to like a Twitch, and they just open packs of cards and people buy them, and it's awesome. But like being able to kind of get embedded in and kind of learn exactly how it works, like you suddenly start to understand the pain points of the business a lot better.
Mhm.
Did something similar with Detroit pizzas. Like I actually learned how to make the pizza dough, and again, I learned how. Okay, this thing takes freaking forever, and now I understand why. When I'm talking to them, they're telling me about how dough is always the choke point. And that's why every time we're trying to solve issues on the business side, we're trying to figure out what can we do to make this better. Whether it's having a bigger mixer or having a bigger facility that we can use to maybe deliver dough out to different places. And getting to do stuff like that or getting to work with the game company and work on their game really closely with them and getting to actually play test and kind of see stuff, it's great because then you kind of not only do you kind of understand their business a little more and I feel like they trust you more, you also get to kind of know other people on the team and again kind of they trust you more and you get to hear things that you need to hear a lot quicker because they're less afraid to be they're less afraid to contact you. It's
Yeah.
great.
I have a question about talking to legal, like toward the end of shipping a product or like,
Yeah.
getting to it. So I used to work with legal at Niantic on different IAPs and app purchases. Like
Yep.
one time we made something, it was basically like a gotcha, like a loot
Yep.
box.
Yeah, yeah.
And they're like, no, 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 you can't do that. So is it beneficial to talk to a lawyer at that point when you have IAP or you have a
As long as
monetization?
you have one who understands what you're doing, yeah. Because again, like there's different areas of everything, and like I say, I consider myself to be like fractional general counsel for game industry companies, stuff like that, tech companies. And what I mean by that is it's kind of like when you have a doctor. You go see a doctor, they can look at the problem, they can diagnose, is this something I can solve or do I need to help bring in an expert? And then normally they know all the experts. They're going to tell you like, oh, here's the rheumatologist I recommend, here's the kidney
Yeah.
doctor I recommend, here's the um, you know, here's the best cancer specialist, stuff like that. Same thing for me. I'm like, I know really good patent lawyers, I know really good immigration lawyers, I know really good, whatever issue pops up that is a little bit outside my wheelhouse. And then when I get to work with something like a game, like when you're coming to launch, it's a lot easier to kind of sit back and be like, okay, here's the different things that we need to look at to make sure that we aren't doing illegal gambling or aren't going to violate loot box laws or um, honestly the biggest thing anymore is privacy dominates our
Okay.
entire industry on the game side, and especially think about something like any of Niantic's games where it's so geolocation based. That's a huge issue because now suddenly they know everywhere you're going,
Mhm.
because they have to make their game work, and then how do you draw up those docs correctly? How do you deal with the fact that we have different privacy laws in California than we do in the rest of the country? How do you deal with the fact that Brazil has privacy rules now that are coming up? How do you deal with GDPR? How do you deal with, Virginia's putting through a new law? There's a few other states that have laws that are getting updated or moved forward. And again, that stuff is something where I always remind people, I'm like, okay, you had your privacy policy looked at 5 years ago. It's probably out of date.
Mhm.
Stuff like that needs almost an annual look at least, if not more, depending on what you're doing. And again, normally the nice thing is you know where your pain points are going to be already. You kind of just know. You may not want to admit it, but you kind of know. It's like, okay, I'm going to have issues with privacy stuff. I'm going to have issues with, gambling or loot boxes or whatever else. I should probably have this looked at, And it's like the moment you have that kind of inkling, it's worth talking to someone, especially again, if you have someone who actually understands your industry on stuff like that, because, some of that can be very specialized and niche.
Yeah.
Um,
Are there any new laws that have popped up with like NFTs or whatever? The loot box thing was quite older, but I just
well,
wasn't aware of it.
I mean, NFTs are funny because again, the moment you start talking about that, the first thing that comes to mind is securities and unregistered securities. And believe it or not, we're still relying on Howie in the Hills, Florida. So the case is Howie, and it's where it came from, it's Florida, about orange groves, and
Oh,
it's a very very old case, way before either of us were born. And again, the whole concept was we wanted to prevent, kind of traveling salesmen from selling, you know, securities to old ladies, And that was the thought process. Now you're going to get lawyers all over the place who are like, that law needs updated. This needs to happen, blah, blah, blah. NFTs shouldn't be securities. NFTs should be securities. NFTs, the reality is it's a very complicated analysis to determine whether anything is going to fit. And at the end of the day, you're going to pay a lot of money and get an it depends. And that is one of the most frustrating parts as a business person, because the reality is we don't always know what the government's going to do, especially with something that old. And I mean, not to get into politics, but you can go look at the Supreme Court right now and just honestly say, I really don't know what way they're going to side on something anymore, because precedent doesn't always get followed the same way it used to, and things can float around. But I mean, the reality is, anytime we think about something like NFTs or crypto or stuff like that, it would be nice to have better understood regulations that the average person could understand versus having to rely on stuff that requires a like 20-page memo from a law firm to know whether or not you're probably going to get in trouble or not.
yeah.
Um, because again, the analysis can get pretty complicated, especially, the moment that you're, bringing together investment type money for, a common endeavor that, yeah.
Just to make it clear, I'm not trying to do NFTs. That was just like an
No,
example.
no, I mean, hey, I'm not trying to give legal advice on here, so I get it. I get it. That's always the disclaimer. One nice thing is I have a buddy Noah, and anytime he and I are on a panel together, I know he's always going to be the guy who's like, disclaimer time. I'm like, man, I got to remember to do it myself sometimes. So, I mean, none of this is meant to be, legal advice. I'm not trying to represent anything on there.
Yeah.
Always matters, your individual circumstances, all that stuff. So,
It's just really good to know. Like, if I had known about the loot box law as a
mm,
younger person, I would have known not to design it that way. So just
yeah.
surfacing it to people is really
Well,
important because
and
there's so many rules.
that's one of the reasons why I do like the fact that I get to go in every year to the production class at FIA, and I'm sure I'll end up working something with Full Sail and UCF, main UCF at some point too. It's just the fact that you get to go in and talk to people, and again, that's why they do it, is because again they view it as it's really essential to understand some of these basics if you're going to make a game.
Mhm.
Because again, like what is protectable, what isn't protectable, what are some of these rules when it comes to things like loot boxes, and where's the industry heading, and where's it going, and where do we need to be more cautious about things. And
Yeah.
that's always a fun conversation. Plus, I mean, I get to go in and just remind people, here's what an NDA means, here's what a non-compete means. Make sure you don't
Yeah.
sign a lot of non-competes, or you can definitely limit yourself in what you do. And again, at this point, a non-compete should be, especially in our industry, should be so highly targeted that it should really only be for like an executive level person or a lead systems designer on something, to keep them from going to the absolute rival company. You
Mhm.
know, like you shouldn't be able to go from being the lead engineer on maybe Call of Duty to then go to Battlefront. But again, you're getting paid for that at that point. And
Yeah.
typically that person's going to go off and create their own thing at that point because they're probably if they are leaving, they're probably just done with the corporate politics and they're ready to just kind of figure out something different, you know?
Mhm.
But no, I really appreciate this chat. This has been awesome. Obviously, if you have any other questions, we can chat another time. Uh,
Yeah, thank you
but,
so much.
this has been great. Thank you again.